like to welcome everyone to this webinar. More of a discussion, I expect, rather than a webinar, about how to get OT cybersecurity projects off the ground. So I'm very excited about this topic. Those of you joining us who are familiar with our research, you'll know that we tend towards offering practical guidance for folks that asset owners and operators. So today's webinar will be exactly that, a very practical blueprint, if you like, for putting together these projects to further secure your industrial enterprise. So before I ramble on too far, let me introduce myself. So my name, for those of you who don't know me, is Jonathan Gordon. I'm the directing analyst here at TP Research, covering the industrial cybersecurity market. So at TP Research, we author various types of market level reports and also very specific reports. As I mentioned, practical guides about how operators can actually minimize the risk to their organizations. And I would say through many of our client engagements that one of the biggest challenges for companies is really how to get started. So who should be involved, who supports, who are the stakeholders, and where to start. So this session today, in this case, should be particularly valuable. Ruben, why don't you introduce yourself?
Yeah, thank you, Jordan. Hello, everybody. My name is Ruben Lobo. I'm part of Cisco's Industrial IoT group. I run product management for our industrial switching and our industrial security portfolio. Looking forward to having a great conversation, Jonathan.
Yeah, likewise. We're going to take a look at the agenda for today. It's really a story based on a very real experience. So I'm going to take us through very quickly a recap of what's been happening of late in the industrial cyberspace. I'll look at what's changing and why. We'll also look at the findings and delve down into the findings of our joint survey, where we asked industrial enterprises where they are in this cybersecurity journey, how they got started, what's important to them, what sort of hurdles they've identified and overcome in the process so far. Then Ruben will take us through very much how to get this done, a section where we're going to talk about the people, the process, the technology involved, and the different options for deployment, and why scalability, for instance, is so key to a long-term solution. And at the very end, we'll bring the story together with some lessons learned from a couple of industrial enterprises that have already undertaken or started to take this journey with Cisco. So just before I kick off, I should say that we will aim to leave plenty of time at the end for questions. So feel free at any point to click on the chat or the Q&A button, put your questions in, and we'll do our best to get to as many as we can. And lastly, we are recording this session. So if you want to take another look at it or share it with colleagues, feel free to do so. So without further ado, a growing sense of urgency, indeed. So this is more of a collection of observation rather than sort of a quantitative approach, but a lot has changed in the last 12 to 24 months. We recently marked the 1-year anniversary since the Russian invasion of the Ukraine, a war that's been truly catastrophic. And the accompanying cyber war has done a lot to increase this sense of urgency, and indeed accelerated a lot of plans around particularly protecting critical infrastructure, both in Europe, close to the conflict, but also far away. Many high-profile attacks, such as Colonial, but even last week, for example, ransomware attack on Dole. All of these keep the topic firmly in the headlines. And I think it's safe to say that we have a serious tailwind behind us that just wasn't there even a couple of years back. So regulations, directives, frameworks are all coming thick and fast. Some are good, some maybe not so good, but all of them are having an impact in building this awareness and helping create this discussion. And it looks like they're going to keep coming as well. Ransomware is the plague of our time, hitting everyone. What's key when we talk about ransomware is we know it doesn't have to be specifically directed at OT or ICS to have an impact on production. Many of the attacks have been IT, but caused production to stop. So it also builds a case for this end-to-end cybersecurity and visibility that we'll talk about later is a big part of that. The boards, the shareholders, the management are also starting to pay much closer attention. Again, partly because of this increased awareness in general, partly because of the regulatory environment, and also things like the potential of personal liability is also on their mind as well. At the same time, we've seen big insurance companies backing off the industrial market, primarily out of fear that something like an all-out war accompanied by cyber will bring down the market and they won't be able to pay out. So the concept of transferring a lot of this risk may be off the table in the short term, in the longer term. And lastly, I'm sure that there's a much longer list as well, but lastly, what we have here is the pace of new technology that impacts the industrial space. It continues to gain momentum all the time, right? The intersection of these type of technologies, whether it's IT, OT, IoT, 5G, cloud, and so on and so forth. And whether you're a supporter or you prefer to take these sort of things slower, the pace continues to grow. So here, that's in a very quick overview, some of the things that are creating this sense of urgency. So I mentioned regulation. I'm going to touch on it a little bit more. Regulation is a good thing in some cases, not so good in other cases, depending on the circumstances. How the regulations should look, how they will look, it's probably a topic for another webinar or maybe several webinars. But I think the most important thing to say is that legislators and regulators and the various governmental bodies have woken up to the risk, right? We see everything from the president's executive orders, things like the cybersecurity, the cyber incident reporting for critical infrastructure that happened not too long ago, the TSA pipeline security directive, CISA's Shields Up program, which is about a year old now, the NCOC projects, and they cover now manufacturing, water, LNG, and the list goes on. And I think it's also important to understand that it's not just in North America, right? The EU has rolled out fundamental directives towards protecting critical infrastructure against potential cybersecurity threats and risks. The NIST directive includes measures to create this high common level of cybersecurity across the EU, but also includes things like resilience of critical entities. So they're directives that work to widen the scope across critical sectors and bring this sort of more unified approach across the EU. But also Australia and other locations. So in Australia, they recently passed legislation and not too long ago published critical infrastructure resilience strategy, which again is about providing a framework for this critical infrastructure. So there's a lot happening. Keep in mind that regulations and compliance are not cybersecurity, right? I think the last thing you want to do is wait for the regulation that may or may not come and may or may not make sense to you, and those sort of timeframes, 5 and 10 years until they actually become effective. So I think what we'll see during the rest of this session is the time to start is now. And while it's great that people are waking up to the need really is to focus on the clear and present risks. For me, it always comes back to risk. And putting that risk into your business context, right? Everyone has, everyone's business is different. And many people seem to be under the illusion that the industrial space is closed environment, that it's static, and nothing could really be further from the truth. The people, the processes, and technology that we're going to speak about today, they're always in motion. And of course, from the external, the threat landscape is constantly evolving. Malicious actors are improving their methods, taking advantage of a lot of these new technologies. So don't be fooled into thinking that you have time to stand still. The risks are there; they're changing. Now, I don't mean to sound the doom and gloom and oh no, you should run for the hills. But I think it's important to be aware, particularly when we're looking at the cyber physical risk. It requires a deep understanding of both cyber risk, but also process automation functions and process safety as well. So understanding what assets you have deployed, where they are, and how critical they are to your business is really fundamental in starting this journey, and also moving the journey forward. So having sort of set the scene, what I'd like to do is start to delve into the into the survey that we conducted not too long ago. So we reached out to a number of industrial enterprises, and the idea was to gauge where they are in this journey and to document how to get a project off the ground from concept, project formation, who's involved, how to build this diverse team, and how to build support, particularly across various stakeholders. And I guess most importantly, how to build this business case and how to get budget and then approval for this. So without further ado, let's get into to look at some of the results and some of the responses that we got. So this graph is really a response with regards to where companies are in the journey. So where it may differ between vertical and region, we can see some companies are getting started, but many others are trying to figure out how to progress from there and maybe scale the solutions across their entire enterprise. So in one way, this is very good news. It reflects, the data really reflects this level of self-awareness and urgency. But Ruben, maybe you can jump in here and let us know, does this match what you're hearing from your customers? Does it line up with where they are?
Yeah, it's quite an accurate representation, I would say. I mean, but if you look at the first stage here and you look at around 11% of this customer base is just getting started with an IDMC, that is quite a scary thought, right? We tend to take this for granted. We assume that there's some perimeter security in place, but you can see here that there are certain customers who are just kind of getting started on this journey. But if you look at the middle section here, the two green bars, most of the customers that we see sit in this area of either starting to deploy visibility solutions or have trialed it in a couple of sites and are now trying to scale it out across all the sites that they have. Historically, when you look at the space, there's been challenges in terms of like the security professionals either having access into this environment or cases where the teams are really stretched and they don't have the resources and bandwidth to go and enter into the space. And quite often I've heard comments of, I don't want to go and look under the carpet because I'm going to find problems, and then those problems are going to become our problems, right? But this landscape, as you said, Jonathan, is changed a lot. It's rapidly changing, has changed over the last couple of years. And now, the Cisco's organization, IT, InfoSec, they're being mandated to not just secure the enterprise side of the house, but also secure like the entire enterprise, including the operations in the line of business. And so most of the customers we see are in this green band here. And what's most important is that the fact that most of the security professionals who are capable of, getting a handle on the risk in this environment and controlling it and improving the posture are really not familiar with the industrial control systems, right? And so it's really important for them to get visibility to the assets and the processes that they're trying to secure. That's why the visibility solutions are really key and kind of are instrumental in getting them started off the ground. And more importantly, it's not that you need an entirely new stack of security products to kind of secure OT. You can pretty much take whatever you have implemented on the enterprise side of the house and bring it into the OT space and implement those controls. But what's key and what's missing is this visibility and context to what these assets are and what they're doing. Once you have that information, you can quickly integrate that information into the rest of your security controls, and you can pretty much bring most of your practices from the IT side of the house into the OT space, right? But the context is key, otherwise you'll end up breaking things. Now, cost and technical resources are, I think, the biggest barriers in accomplishing this visibility project. We'll come back to that later as we go into some of the sections further down the line. Now, moving on to the next stage, in the blue bars, this reflects more advanced customers, right? Now, segmentation can be a little bit misleading because we've got many customers who have implemented segmentation below the DMZ, meaning they've segmented level 3 and level 2. But a lot of these controls kind of have been built from a top-down view, from a network-centric standpoint, without real visibility into what's happening in level 2, right? And so there's a danger that even though when you're looking from level 3 into the industrial control network, everything from your perspective might look segmented, but if you don't have visibility to what's happening down in level 2, your segmentation might be compromised. And we have an example of a use case that we'll talk about later on that covers that. And the other thing that we observe is most customers who are in this blue range of, advanced to this blue range and have put in security controls, segmentation controls with visibility, have, taken into account what it's going to take that visibility and feed it up to the SOC and integrate it with the rest of the security controls, right? So stage 3 and 4 over here in the blue bars tend to happen in parallel.
Essentially, I think what we're seeing here is that there are people at these different stages, and I think it tends to start with visibility, and then, as you said, they more advanced. So I think that was actually a question that came in. It's interesting to see OT visibility before IoT, IT, or OT network segmentation. But I think the crux of what we're seeing is that visibility is required to sort of move beyond a certain stage.
And one key point, Jonathan, to kind of clarify there, right? When we're talking about segmentation here, we're not talking about segmentation between IT and OT. That segmentation between IT and OT is the dark blue on the left-hand side. We're talking about segmenting the OT network itself to prevent, the spread of threats.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess, that's the industrial DMZ at 3.5 that we normally see there. Okay. So let's have a look at, I guess, what's driving the need for OT visibility and security. So why start the journey at all, I guess, is the question. And it's clear from the results that we got on the survey, and I guess from discussions, that there are several drivers, but it seems like risk management is sort of gravitated to the number one or very high on many people's lists. I guess about taking more control, but the costs always seem to be an issue. Ruben, can you walk us through again what you guys are seeing? Is there a noticeable shift towards risk management as opposed to compliance or putting out fires? And then if so, how are the enterprises going about this?
I think that the reason's fairly straightforward, right? You can't really secure what you can't see. And first thing you got to get control over is, your security posture and the risk in your environment. So that's kind of what triggers most of these projects. Now, if you look at some of the answers there, you can see a breach and attack being at 34. Now that's one cause of going down this project. But more often, you're not just reacting to the fact that you've been breached and you're trying to do something. Very often, or rather, I'd say in most cases, companies are digitizing their businesses and they're connecting more and more assets, right? And quite often these assets are getting connected to the cloud as well. And so everybody understands clearly that the attack surface is increasing with this increased connectivity, and they need to start looking at this space that previously might have been ignored, right? And the first step there, like you said, Jonathan, is to get a handle on the risk, so you understand what your current state is. And then, you can figure out how to get it under control, how to get your posture under control, and then maintain it as you digitize your business, right? And if you look at all the other things mentioned here, and I can give you an example of usually what we see when a visibility solution gets deployed in an OT network. There are three things that we commonly find, and they kind of tend to reflect the responses that you're seeing here on this graph. The first thing is kind of like a shock reaction. If you flip to the other slide, Jonathan, the first thing that you see is like a shock reaction to the number of outbound connections that they discover, right? Everybody assumes that they have this DMZ in place and that, it's properly protected, but usually what happens is firewall rules have been manipulated over time to kind of like service the needs of the business. There's connectivity requirements, and so you punch in holes through the firewall. The firewall then tends to become, like for the DMZ especially, tends to become fairly leaky. The other thing that most customers tend to find out, depending on obviously the industrial vertical you're in, is there's a lot of shadow IT kind of like backdoors in place, right? They either put in by the line of business itself, through cellular connections because it's just convenient and easy to connect systems. But more often than not, you've got these cellular routers that are brought in by the system integrators and machine builders, trying to get access to data on their systems so they can improve performance. And so all of these things kind of tend to start becoming visible to the folks who are trying to secure this environment through this visibility, through the journey of implementing these visibility projects. The second thing that we notice most often is kind of being overwhelmed with the number of vulnerabilities that they discover in this space. It's no secret that most of these systems haven't been patched for a very long time. Either you can't patch it because the software is so old that you'll break it and you'll impact your warranty, or they just have been kind of like neglected, right? And so the challenge there is, which vulnerability do you tackle first? Where everything looks red, where do you start even, right? And especially in cases where you have tens of thousands of assets, it's quite a daunting task. And so that's where solutions that give you guidance past the typical CVSS score, which tends to be high on all these vulnerabilities, is information on which of these vulnerabilities are being actively exploited in the field, that kind of guide you to saying, okay, start here, address these ones first, because these are the highest risk vulnerabilities that you have in your environment, and then slowly go down the list, kind of tend to be very useful. And then the last part is, kind of like the fact that these environments are really neglected. It's not uncommon to see that systems have already been compromised, right? Many customers find out that they've been breached. And that happens kind of as part of this visibility project that they've kicked off. Maybe the damage has not been done, but you can see that there is signs of malicious activity in these environments that often get found. And so all of this, to summarize, is kind of like anchored in risk and being able to understand your security posture. Once you get a handle on that, then you can move to the next stages of securing this environment.
Right. So I guess it goes back to a few of the points that we discussed earlier. One is about really trying to understand this from a risk point of view, more strategic than just putting out fires or compliance. As people move towards that end of the spectrum, the approach becomes less tactical, more strategic. And we also talked about the environment actually being in flux all the time, right? You mentioned things like shadow IT and lots of changes made to things like firewall rules, and could also be configuration down to PLCs and things like that are not necessarily, change management may not be in place in all these. So there's all this change taking place where you thought it was a static environment, you thought it was under control. Even if you did some sort of assessment, say 5 years ago, 3 or 4 years ago, it's no longer relevant. And that's, I think, where I guess what you're talking about, and some of these results come back as well. It kind of leads us into how all of these things come together. This always seems incredibly complex, both from a technology point of view, but sometimes more importantly from a people process point of view. Everybody, or most everybody in the industrial environment, understands risk, the concept of risk. It's kind of like the common denominator, but different people with different roles, like you mentioned that, they could be in the NetSec team, they could be in OT engineering, automation, InfoSec, could be the chief risk officer. Everybody seems to look at risk within their sort of worldview and their understanding. And it could be from the shareholders to the management to the CISO to all these different teams. So on one hand, risk can really bring everyone around that table. But it seems many of the challenges, even for the technology side, around the people and the processes. So I guess the question is really, how do we build this diverse, multidisciplinary team? How do we get them to align? Because to start these projects, I assume that is really key. So Ruben, how do you see these asset owners dealing with this? Is it important? And what are the sort of keys to success in doing this?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Jonathan. Quite often folks tend to jump into the technology first before paying attention to this, because the project gets kicked off by one group or the other, right? But the org structure and understanding what each stakeholder wants and needs to get out of these projects is really critical, and that can usually make or break the project, the success of the project. Typically, what we see is that projects are either kicked off by the CISO because he or she has been mandated to secure the operational side of the house as well, or it could be IT or NetSec extending security controls below the DMZ down into level 2 of the network, and it's a natural kind of like progression. Those are the two kind of areas we typically tend to see how projects get kicked off, these security projects get kicked off. Now, if you think about who starts a project and what the implications are, typically when projects are led by the InfoSec team, what they're most interested in understanding is getting visibility to the assets, understanding what the vulnerabilities are, so they can take the necessary precautions there. And these teams are interested in the data. They don't necessarily pay attention to how this data is made available to them, right? And so very little attention usually is paid to what is this going to cost me if I have to operationalize this at a large scale outside of the POC being conducted. So it's really important in this case to make sure that you're engaging the IT, the NetOps side of the house, because what we typically tend to see is when these projects have to roll out, the team that actually has the manpower is generally tends to be the IT side of the house. The budget may be held by the line of business, in certain cases by individual plants in the business, but the folks who can actually deploy the solution and make that data available to InfoSec tends to be IT or NetOps. And so it's really important to kind of engage that stakeholder early in the journey, so you're making the right choice in picking the solution. Now, on the other side, certain projects get kicked off with like a threat-centric view. And if you're looking at something beyond your typical signature-based detection, and you're getting into some advanced stuff like trying to look into PLC code and trying to see if like certain control blocks have been manipulated, you really have to ask, beyond the typical bells and whistles that you might see in a POC, what does this mean to operationalize in a multi-vendor environment, right? Is the solution I'm picking, does the vendor of the solution I'm picking have influence over these giant OEMs that control this entire ecosystem? They're going to do and change the things whenever they want. What does that mean to the solution you're deploying, right? And can you react fast enough to be able to cope up with that change? And more importantly, is do you have this multidisciplinary team put in place where the members of your team have to be comprised of control engineers who can actually understand what ladder logic is and make sense of something that's changed, right? Because, like as you said, these environments are very dynamic, and just having, a change might be something that somebody did on purpose, right? And that doesn't necessarily indicate a threat. So you have to think through, am I funded to staff this dotted line team of experts that I need to help me out? And how do I scale this across like 100 different sites, right? And that's so you need to engage the operations team early on. And lastly, if the project is kickstarted, let's say by IT or NetSec, and they're typically trying to push segmentation further into the network to secure the environment and prevent like the spread of threats, right? And they're using visibility to drive segmentation. They need that visibility to make sure that while segmenting the environment, they're not breaking things. But they have to pay attention to what the other stakeholders need in this environment. Like, what does InfoSec need? What's the vulnerability management platform that InfoSec is using? And how do you feed data to that platform? And does the data you're feeding have all the necessary attributes that InfoSec is looking for, right? On the other hand, they need to, the IT NetSec teams need to think about what is SecOps requiring from them? Like, how do I take this information and feed it into the SOC? These environments tend to be really chatty and very noisy. And so, quite often you end up sending too much information and this just becomes noise, right? And you can't detect the real, information from the noise there. And so what information do I actually send up to the SOC? What's the closed loop control between the SOC and the operations team? Because let's say you send the right amount of data, so the SOC detects an incident, who do they call to verify? Right? Like, who's down on the plant floor? And so all of these things need to be considered. And so the org structure, people processes are just as important as the technology.
Yeah, indeed. I think too much we find people asking, what's in it for me with their worldview, and bringing everyone together, I think serves the organization much better. So we're kind of running a little bit short on time, so we'll try and move through the next set of slides quicker, so we can save time for questions. So really, with regards to the technology, we talked about the people and processes, but very quickly talking about the complexity, we asked the survey participants as well to tell us about the main obstacles they've sort of encountered across the way. We can already see some complexities involved in the project like this. So I guess, why is it so complex, and how can we scale these sort of projects in the architecture cost effectively? Is it even possible?
Yeah. So if you move on to the next slide here, Jonathan, typically when you look at the the start of the journey and visibility solutions, you've got the DPI location matters, right? And so usually you have two mechanisms to do this. You're doing deep packet inspection of control traffic, trying to get visibility to the assets and context as to what they're doing. And the second approach is active discovery, where you're actually talking to the assets and getting information about from the assets themselves. And it's very effective when you do both of these in parallel. That's when you get the maximum use. Now, how you implement the solution and where you mirror the traffic really matters, right? So if you go too high in the network at the aggregation layer, you're only going to get visibility to north-south traffic, which is probably less than 20% of the assets you have in your environment. If you go down to the bottom, what you really need is access down to the access layer where all the assets are sitting and communicating. And that can very often become quite expensive. So if you think about, say, manufacturing as an example, most of the assets, most of the traffic doesn't even leave the cell, right? So if you tap the network too high at an aggregation layer, you might get visibility to PLCs, maybe the HMIs and workstations, but you're not going to see the I/O and drives and all the sensors that are sitting down there. Switching to maybe, let's say, utility as an example. If all you're interested is in SCADA and control, that's very hub-spoke centric traffic, right? So you can just mirror traffic at the control center and the front-end processor and get visibility to everything. But then what about all the assets inside the substation that are, let's say, doing protection, right? Now, if you're doing teleprotection, obviously that traffic might traverse the WAN and you might be able to get it at the WAN router. But what about your local protection schemes like bus bar protection, feeder protection? And you're never going to see all those relays if you don't access the network at the bottom. So it's really important to pay attention to where you're getting access to this information. And quite often, because these solutions are expensive, you don't get the full value of what you're trying to implement. So if we move on to the next slide, you have to mirror traffic one way or another. And the question is how do you go about it? Now, you might be tempted to span the traffic within the network itself. Your networking infrastructure might be able to do things like RSPAN, where you're spanning within the network itself. But be very careful when you do this, because if your traffic tends to get, your span traffic tends to get aggregated, and you're going to start causing head of line blocking on these switches, and that can introduce jitter, which is really, really bad for control systems. So you got to be very careful while implementing RSPAN. So your only option then in that case would be to implement a out of span network, right? And that can get very expensive very quickly. You have to maintain a completely parallel network, and what we see in most cases is the cost of the cabling itself to get access to the lowermost sections of the network is more expensive than the entire project itself, just the cabling cost. And so most of the time what happens is you end up just deploying active discovery in this environment and not doing any DPI because you can't go deep enough, or you're just doing DPI at a very high level. So the most effective way to do this really is to mirror traffic internally to the switch. That is, you deploy your sensors within the networking infrastructure itself. And so when you do that, what happens is you don't have this issue of span. You can leverage your existing infrastructure. All the mirroring happens inside the switch, so there's no out-of-band network, and none of it is impacting the control plane, right? So there's no jitter in the network. And the most important part here is, at first, it might appear to be expensive when you just look at it. When you look at it and say, "Oh, I got to kind of replace my network." Now, obviously, you can't replace a network in a brownfield environment. You got to come up with alternate solutions. But you can always look to what is my next extension going to look like, right? And it's not just and you have to take into account the total cost of ownership. So when you take into account the total cost of ownership and account for the fact that once you get this visibility and you move on to the next stage of segmenting your network, that same networking infrastructure can help you segment the network and get you to the next stage. You find out that the total cost of ownership on the solution to the right is a lot lower.
It kind of makes sense. We do see a lot of people hesitant about starting these projects just because of the cost and the scalability, the complexity, and anything that can be done, I think, to make it easier and more manageable is a good thing. Let me very quickly, I just want to recap the what we've been doing up until now. So pulling everything together, we've sort of discussed the role of the people and processes, why it's important to get alignment, create that diversity within the team, which I've said a few times. I think it's super important and sometimes the hardest part of all. We've reviewed some of the concerns now about the architecture and the costs and scalability. If you're going to get visibility and get this sort of control, you really need it end to end. It's not much point getting visibility across 30, 40, 50% of your network. To be effective, you need much more than that. So the scalability is really key. And I think lastly, to the need to align all of this within the business context, how to get these projects off the ground. They're really business decisions like any other business decision. Cybersecurity needs to put forward a compelling business case. So it's quite often we get this question or comment from client engagements, specifically in this area. And it's kind of an interesting thing where they tell us they having trouble sort of proving the need internally and getting buy-in until they have something in place that shows that visibility, shows the picture that hasn't been seen. But at the same time, they can't put something in place until they prove the need. So it's very chicken and egg dilemma here. So Ruben and I, we were discussing this, and I think you have some ideas about how companies can possibly do a quick start or definitely a quick start to proving the case. And you mentioned that the cloud is a potential answer to that.
Yeah, assessments are when you get stuck in this proving the value situation, assessments are really, really useful, right? And typically the challenges in running these assessments is like how do you put in a system in place to get access to this data and run this POC. It could take a lot of time. So what we recently launched in February in Amsterdam is our CyberVision solution on our IoT operations dashboard cloud platform, right? And we launched the solution really to take care of visibility and needs in the for distributed environments. We've got a lot of use cases where you've got solar farms, wind farms, traffic intersections, widely distributed sites that need to be secured. And scaling becomes a real challenge with on-prem solutions in those environments. And that's why we introduced Cybervision on our IoT operations dashboard platform. And one of the key things that we enabled in that case is not just for distributed sites, but for any industrial control system, the ability to do quick evaluations, right? The ability to do an assessment by simply being able to capture traffic at a certain portion of your industrial network, and taking those PCAPs, uploading them up to the cloud, and kind of getting the same outcome, right? You'll still end up uncovering those IT backdoors. You'll still start seeing those vulnerabilities. In certain cases, you still start detecting those breaches that have happened. So all of that can quickly materialize by simply capturing some traffic in your location, and getting this visibility and using that to then kickstart a project. And we found that
and that sort of bypasses the lengthy times that we normally see for POCs or proof of values as well. It's always difficult to be able to get something lower down in the network and getting a window to do that. So I like this sort of concept of being able to move very quickly. It's something that's not seen often in our sort of part of the space. So I guess the last thing to do is really to pull it all together and talk about a couple of these use cases that we have. So Ruben, do you want to let us know what's going on with this particular use case?
Yeah, so we've got two use cases that we're going to go through, and this one in particular is the example of a global leader in flooring, right? Multinational company, has footprint all across the world, and this is an example of a fairly mature company that had this was an IT/NetSec driven project. They had advanced to a point where, without visibility, had already started to implement segmentation below the DMZ. So they had started to segment level 3 and level 2 using industrial firewalls, to secure the infrastructure. And what ended up happening in this particular case is that there was an external audit that took place, and the audit revealed that the plant floor in one particular plant was a huge cyber risk, and it kind of really baffled the IT team, because what the audit revealed was that the whole plant, the level 2 was a flat network, and IT couldn't really understand it, because from their perspective, looking level 3 down, they had segmented the network using firewalls. It turned out that the line of business, for convenience sake, had bridged everything in level 2. Right, so the entire level 2 network was bridged. So even though for IT, looking top down, the network looked segmented, and from all traffic that was going north-south, that they had visibility to appear to be traversing the firewalls. In reality, anybody could traverse the whole plant across the layer 2 network because it was bridged. And so they ended up deploying Cybervision on the Cisco IE3000 series switches down in the plant floor. And that visibility, helped them identify where exactly these inter-zone communications were taking place, so that they could identify the locations where the network was bridged and kind of like bring back the network to compliance, right? And one of the key things that took place during the course of this project was IT used this visibility and brought OT into the project really early on. And when OT started to see the visibility that they were getting, they ended up realizing that although they had a really good handle on what the control system looked like, they really didn't know how the control system was leveraging the network. So that really helped them kind of troubleshoot issues they were having. And they saw, during the course of implementation of the project, they actually ended up solving some downtime problems with that visibility, right? And that's what really sealed the deal and made this project successful.
the next case study?
Yeah. So this one is a leading car manufacturer, and this is a classic case of various departments trying to achieve kind of like different objectives, right? So it started off with this customer in a particular plant having a lot of downtime problems due to misconfiguration of the network itself. So it was a networking issue that got IT involved into the environment, and so IT came in and started standardizing on a certain brand of Cisco switches here, Cisco i2000s, and they managed to stabilize the network and improve uptime. Right after that, on the back of that, as the project was rolling out, InfoSec got involved, and InfoSec came at it from a completely different angle, which is they wanted to understand risk and security posture. And they started trialing some visibility solutions. They picked out a few visibility solutions, and they were getting ready to go deploy it. That's when IT was engaged, and they quickly realized that it was going to be really expensive to deploy a solution where they could actually get visibility to the access layer, right? And so rather than try and build out, an expensive out-of-band span collection network and deal with all the costly cabling and all of that stuff, they ended up actually, moving to the i3000 switches with the sensor, CyberVision sensor embedded in the network, right? And that kind of gave them the visibility they needed without having to increase the cost of having to meet the needs of OT, where they needed to stabilize the network and provide constant uptime. As you know, in an auto industry, like downtime can be like really, really expensive. It's you count it in the matter of minutes. So they were able to provide a rock solid network to make sure that the uptime that OT needed was there. At the same time, they were able to meet the needs of InfoSec by getting them visibility to assets and vulnerabilities.
Perfect. So we managed to squeeze everything in, which was quite a mission. So thank you very much for that, Ruben. We've had a bunch of questions come in, which I'll get to in a second. I just want to make sure that everybody sees the download link here. I think Bailey just sent it in the chat as well. You can get access to the full report off of this short link here and learn more about Cisco's industrial cybersecurity solutions as well. So we'll spend the last 7 minutes or so on some of these questions, if that's okay with you, Ruben. I'll start by asking and answering the first one, which is a relatively easy one. Will you provide a copy of the slides? So the answer is yes, we can do that. We'll follow up with the people that requested the slides. And I mentioned in the very beginning, this will be recorded, so you'll also get a link to the recording after that. So as I said, there are quite a number of questions that come in. One of the questions, I think, towards the beginning was when we put up the graphs of OT visibility, sort of what stages people are at. So somebody mentioned that it was interesting to see visibility before IT OT network segmentation. So I mean, you touched on that a number of times, Ruben, but I think the key is really you can't do anything without seeing. Right? I mean, you have this concept of risk and sure, engineers are always sitting down and trying to determine what's their biggest, most expensive piece of equipment that can go bang, and what's the plan, or how do we protect that? And then cybersecurity are really about how to protect that. But so just maybe you want to circle back and just reiterate where that visibility and segmentation sort of come in and overlap.
Right. Yeah. So, the highest level of segmentation that you start off with is building a DMZ, right? An industrial DMZ that is essentially securing that OT network from, both from the IT enterprise side to the rest of the internet, depending upon how you're connected. So that's basic. So that you kind of assume that's step number one. You always kind of like start there. From there on, I think the use case, the customer case study that we spoke about really demonstrates effectively like what happens if you put visibility, below the DMZ, you segment the network below the DMZ without visibility. there's no guarantee that you actually built out the segmentation, right? There are ways to bypass that segmentation level. And so, yes, you can build. The two things happen. You can build broad segmentation and have the false sense of security that that segmentation is actually working, right? Without assurance that it might be bridged at the bottom. Or the second thing that might happen is you might end up trying to segment the network and break legitimate communication flows and cause downtime, right? And very quickly, the line of business will like kind of show you the door right after that, because downtime is not acceptable in these environments, right? So having visibility first goes a long way.
So a question that just came in, where somebody asked, control systems are very, in fact, there were two questions that were sort of along the same line. So control systems are quite proprietary, usually old legacy equipment. And a similar question along the same lines was, well, I'm going to connect them. It was about losing a warranty when you install these type of sensors, I guess, in and around those pieces of equipment. So I guess the question is, how do you deal with these aging pieces of equipment, and what, in this sort of situation when you're providing visibility and then going on to build this sort of perimeter or micro segmentation around them when you get to that end, and what relationship is there to the ability to actually make changes in and around, like when is the warranty void in that particular case?
Yeah, and so sometimes there's you can't patch the system, right? Because it's just too old and there's nothing you can do about it. And so it's not uncommon to kind of build a security measure around that particular system itself, right? And so we have customers who put in like firewalls or some kind of network-based segmentation around these systems that they know they cannot patch, right? That's kind of what we've seen most commonly is you build, I mean, we've seen customers go all the way to the point where that segmentation is built out. So you kind of like lock it within what other assets that particular system needs to talk to. And there are times at which they open it up to allow, IT scans to take place as an example, right? So there's downtime during which they actually allow the vulnerability assessment information, thing to take place. So, but that's typically how we've seen customers deal with systems that are old and cannot be patched.
I think maybe we have we have 2 minutes left for a very, very short answer. Unfortunately, I'm not sure that we can cover it, but the question is visibility really enough? And I think what we've tried to cover today is that it's not enough, but it's very often the starting point to everything else that you do. So where do you go? And keep in mind that we have about a minute and a half, but where do you go once you have that visibility?
Yeah. So visibility, like you said, is the starting point, right? And from there on, I think the very next thing that you want to do is you want to try and reduce the zones of trust in the environment. So in case a threat makes it in, and it will, because of the fact that you said these are such dynamic environments, it doesn't spread and take down the entire control system, right? So you start with visibility, and then you get in and you build in segmentation, and you bring in all your measures. You start putting threat detection solutions in there, and you start feeding that information, to InfoSec. You start feeding information to the SOC, and like I said earlier, you don't need completely new systems and completely new solutions to do all of this. You can pretty much take everything that you're doing in your enterprise and bring that practice down into the industrial network, as long as you have visibility and context. Those are the two critical pieces of information that allow your IT systems to get applied in this space.
I think you did a great job answering the question in the time allotted, but I think that it's not just about securing the OT space, but we've seen a lot of ransomware where it hasn't made it onto the OT side, but the asset owners or operators haven't had the confidence to keep those systems up. So I think that's another really good use case to say, if you have control and you understand the environment, that's what the visibility provides you. So you don't have to make those kind of decisions. We've run out of time, so I want to thank everyone. thank you all for attending. I hope you found it valuable. I really enjoyed the discussion. I'd like to thank Ruben in particular, Cisco, our sponsor, Industrial Cyber for hosting us. And I hope to see all you guys on the next event. So stay safe and stay secure. And we'll see you soon.